Um, so now it's all yours. So I would suggest keep it to about 15 minutes so that we
Yeah.
have time for questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you see this?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great.
Nice.
Okay, so I am presenting on the climate action plans in India. It was initially titled Climate Policy in India, but then I realized that the climate action plans are actually a fraction of the climate policy in India. Anyway, so yes. So there are two main aspects to it. The first is the National Action Plan on Climate Change, which is the NAPCC, um, which is a country level document. It's sort of a more guiding document than anything else. And then based on that, every state has their own state action plans on climate change, which I will come to in a minute. So how it started was NAPCC was launched in 2008 by Dr. Manmohan Singh. And this is at a time where there were relatively very few countries which had such a policy document on comprehensive policy document on climate change, which is barely a decade ago and appalling in itself. But the idea was to find a balancing act between India's development goals and India's sustainable so, and how to also tackle the challenges presented by climate change at the same time. Adaptation and mitigation were at the time still emerging concepts, at least in the mainstream. And the idea was also to explore how India can mitigate its emissions and also adapt to the coming changes in changes due to climate change. So how they went about it is that they created 8 submissions. It's a very sectoral approach. One of its main criticisms has been that there's very little interaction or integration between these 8 different missions. But just to go over these, there was the National Solar Mission focusing solely on promoting solar energy. There was the Mission for Enhanced Energy Efficiency, which was focused on industrial energy use. The Sustainable Habitat, which was for urban areas. Um, the Water Mission, which had a specific target of 20% improvement in water use efficiency. There was a separate mission for the Himalayan ecosystem. This is because the Himalayas were identified as a particularly vulnerable ecological zone, which would have a cascade effect on the plains also, since most of our, since at least in the northern part of India, a lot of the water resources are dependent on what happens up in the Himalayas. There was a mission for forest cover, which is basically a target set for improving forest cover goal, but it did not say much about what kind of forest cover or the quality of forest cover, but that is a different um, presentation. And there's a mission for sustainable agriculture promoting climate resilient crops. So that's adaptation and also weather insurance for farmers. And strategic knowledge on climate change, because the time at which this policy was presented, there was very little information. Actually, there was, but not in a coherent manner, information on how climate change was going to affect India. So the idea was to develop information networks within the country and form linkages with institutions outside the country to build an information capacity on climate change. And currently, there are talks for creating a separate mission on which will specifically look at India's coastline, because these are also, again, especially vulnerable areas. Firstly, because of rising sea levels, and secondly, because of increased frequency of extreme events like cyclones. This is the governance structure for, well, governance, but how the responsibilities were allocated for the different missions. As you can see, these are all extremely siloized, and there's actually very little cross-sectoral action happening between these different strategies. Um, and that is an issue that continues up till today. So what exactly did the NAPCC say apart from the 8 sectors that it identified? The main goal stated categorically was that the priority was high economic growth and while also creating co-benefits to address climate change. So co-benefits are development actions which have a two-pronged benefit. So basically, they address climate action while also ensuring growth. And there is a very shady pledge that Manmohan Singh made that per capita emissions would not exceed that of developed countries, completely omitting that if a population as large as India were to reach that level of per capita emissions, that would be catastrophic in itself. At the time, there were no real commitments on mitigating emissions, but that has been addressed separately through INDCs up to now. Differential vulnerability was not addressed. So differential vulnerability is um, basically everybody is not vulnerable to the impacts of climate change in the same way. A lot of it depends on your socioeconomic profile. So people who are likely to be vulnerable in other respects, such as economics, gender, caste, class, geography, all that factors into how vulnerable you are to climate change. But the NAPCC didn't really say much about that. So based on the NAPCC, all the states were directed to create a state action plan document for themselves. The SAPCCs were critical because the NAPCC in itself was quite vague, and this was a chance for the states to give their inputs, make it more context specific to their own local context. And there were two parts to it. The first was create information on the state's own impacts on climate change and also its specific vulnerabilities and the specific sectors in which there was firstly a potential to address climate change and secondly sectors which were particularly vulnerable, and also the opportunities there were to adapt. So what was seen was that because of this, there was a lot of local flavor in the SAPCCs themselves. However, there was little uniformity in methodology, although all of them followed the template that the NAPCC had given to them. They all were working with different budgets for what they could actually do about the SAPCC rather than just outlining a plan. There were inconsistencies in data, again, depending on who was working on the SAPCC. So the states were not working by themselves. They were helped by external agencies. The donor agencies also got themselves involved in the SAPCC. So this was great because they had the resources that the states by themselves did not. But then the idea was that the donor agencies would then impart some sort of technical expertise in climate change in the state departments. But that ended up not happening because in some cases, because the donor agencies themselves imposed a sort of framework or a guiding methodology, and just it wasn't a long-term capacity building. It was just there for the time during which the SAPCC was written. And also, a lot of the SAPCCs themselves reflect that the state agencies then had very little input to give into the SAPCC. And it was actually the donors who were sort of driving the whole process, which defeats the whole point of the SPCC. Um, there were two main aspects of mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation, most states chose to act upon wherever it aligned with their development goals, which makes sense for the states themselves. So, development goals and priorities. So, for example, Sikkim focused extensively on water resources because springs in Sikkim are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and that is where most of their water supply comes from. So that's where they focused. Orissa chose to focus on industries because that was their development priority at the time, and it was getting very little interest from others. So this is where they chose to make the most of the um, SAPCC. So although mitigation was a priority for all of them, not all of them even created a greenhouse gas inventory, which would act as a baseline. So if you're taking any sort of mitigation action, it's very hard to tell whether you've had a positive impact or not, unless you have baseline data, which the states did not have, which was quite surprising. But that was apparently a directive given to them by the national level authorities, which did not really make sense. There was also disparity in quality depending on how invested the local bureaucracy was in. There are some excellent examples that have come up, and these have mostly been led by local bureaucrats who've taken an interest in the project. And also the timing. Some states had moved on to drafting a second round of their SAPCCs at a time when some states had not even finalized their first draft. So there's that. And again, in the SAPCC also, what was seen was that there was very little cross-sectoral integration because they basically modeled it according to what the National Committee told them. And yeah, so the second round of SAPCCs is currently being prepared. Some states have already presented their final SAPCC. I believe Himachal presented it for approval last year, but I'm not sure what happened to it since then. But again, like I said, implementation also has drastically varied with, in some states, it's basically suggestive, and some states are actually taking it seriously. And this is reflected in the kind of resources that they allocate to them also. So like the number of people that they have working in a department dedicated to this, the funds that they have allocated for this. So yeah, in a way it's also reflective of how well the state is functioning in itself, but that is my own hypothesis. That's it.
Thank you, Aprajita. I have several questions, but I'm going to open it up to others to ask first. We have a small group today, so I think everybody can badger Aprajita as much as we want.
Okay, I'll go first. Hi, Aprajita. Thank you for that. I had just two questions. The first was the developed countries pay India quite a fair bit in the climate funds. I just googled the number, and the number is about $1 billion. So where exactly does that fit in?
In this,
Yeah. So how does it come into the country
yeah.
and
So
into this?
so there's technology and there's funds transfer. So let's say the National Solar Mission, the technology inputs could be used there, and the solar mission could also use funds. The National Mission for Sustaining Himalayan Ecosystem, for example, it carries out a lot of research, but not by itself. It what's the word? Hands it over to gives grants to other organizations to carry out this sort of research, and I think so do the other missions. So there isn't like a uniform way in which these funds are distributed, but they're all funded by the center. The SAPCC also, states were given some amount of money from the center by um, for the process of creating their SAPCC, because it was a resource intensive exercise. And a lot of the funds is not necessarily like directly given. I was talking about the donor agencies and how they contributed to the SAPCC. So that was also a part of that would also count as funds given as part of the, um, what is the term you used? Yeah, climate action funds transferred to India. So those would also count there.
Got it. The second question was, this was established in 2008. So are there any concrete implementations for some successful states that we would know about?
Implementations for states specifically. So um, these are actually very broad plans. So it's hard to pick out one example, but I think so. Like I spoke about Sikkim and how their focus was on water resources. So Sikkim actually had a very successful. It's used as a model case study in a lot of cases. Um, they had a very successful springshed management plan, which was targeted at reviving spring sheds which were being affected by climate change. So that funding was also a part of this. So yeah, and that was developed under the SAPCC. So usually what they did was not create specifically new programs, but more focus was on core benefits. So how to tweak existing policies and development trajectories so that the focus is more on climate mitigation or adaptation. But the Sikkim program, if you're interested in reading up about it, it's called Dhara Vikas Yojana. Um, and that was a part of their SAPCC.
If there is any write-up about the Sikkim program, I mean, you could just share that either in the chat window or with the group. Something, I think that would be a good thing.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of documentation. Full disclosure, this is what I did my master thesis on. Yeah.
Send us your thesis.
No. But I will share. There's a lot of interesting documentation, and I'll happily send it by email, I think, because I'll have to go through my old files. But yeah, it's actually a model that's now being replicated across the Himalayan regions, because a lot of the Himalayan states have similar concerns about drying spring sheds.
Please do. And given that we have Chaya, who's in Kalimpong, but not too far from Sikkim, might also help us connect us with what's going on now, in case you're no longer involved in that work.
Yeah, I think the work sort of dried out for various reasons, change in bureaucracy, etc. But it's been carried on elsewhere now.
Great. Any other questions? Vedita, Alok, Nishit?
Yeah, I could come up with a question. Thanks, Aprajita, for that. I had a question about the revision of these plans, and you said that the second phase is about to come out now. So, can you tell us a little bit about, are there some changes in the process with which these plans are going to be carried out? Are they going to be more bottom up? Any light on that?
Yes. So I have only a limited amount of information about the second draft, because a lot of them are not in the public sphere yet. But from what I can tell is that they revised it according to a revised development trajectory. So yeah, that was one thing, just to sort of realign it with what is currently happening in the state. And also, hopefully, a more intersectoral approach was used, but that is again not something that's guaranteed across all the SAPCCs. The process itself, I am not sure about, but I think that this time around they're less dependent on donor agencies. But again, that will not be the case for everybody, because some states were able to build that capacity in the initial development of the SAPCC and some states were not. So those who weren't will still be dependent on external aid. Although that is their, some amount of external technical expertise will be there um, for things such as climate modeling, um, which require a very niche knowledge. Uh, yeah.
Got it. Thank you.
Nishit, Alok.
I can ask a question. Um, so, are these plans mostly focused on restoring it to a certain stage, or is this only mitigation? Like, are we also trying to actively engage in afforesting areas, or is this mostly to avert disasters and containing it?
Um, it's both. The mitigation aspect, some amount of it does look at afforestation, although that forms only a small part of the action plans that I've seen. So that comes under the forestry section, green cover section of these plans. A lot more focus is on adaptation, I think, especially for the states who did a comprehensive evaluation of the kind of local level impacts that they were going to see in these states. So they're trying to figure out ways how to incorporate adaptation into the both adaptation and mitigation actions into the kind of development pathways that they want the state to take.
I guess the reason why I'm asking that question is because can we uh, are we aiming for to restore it in a way that it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or are we trying to set a goal where we're trying to achieve, say, one less than 1 degree of temperature increase? Like what would be the aim that we're overall as a nationwide policy that we're trying to achieve? Uh, but I think you sort of answered that. Or I don't know.
Yeah, no, but if you're asking about the National Action Plan, so like I said, it didn't make any commitments towards cutting emissions, but that comes under the INDCs. And I think that our current commitment is cutting emissions by 30 to 35% by 2025, and the baseline is our 2005 emissions. 30 to 35% emissions intensity, not emissions. So reducing emission intensity by that much. And then that aligns itself with the goal set in the Paris Agreement, which is like 1 degree or 2 degree. But at the state level, they have done some sort of modeling, but that is not they're not focused towards. Obviously, it does have to contribute towards the national contributions, nationally determined contributions, but the state action plans themselves, most of them don't really have done such calculation of their emissions. Like I said, a lot of them didn't even do their greenhouse gas inventory, so it's hard to tell.
Thank you.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm using the Zoom browser on my Chrome browser for the very first time because Zoom wasn't opening, so just checking. Aprajita, just thank you for presenting this high-level view of NAPCC, and I just found it quite interesting to just see the overall connections between everything. I had a couple of questions, but I'll just choose one for now. And I want to pick your brain to understand if there's one big gap which is there with the entire strategy which the government has come up with, what would the gap be in your through your studies, and um, is that gap solvable in the next, say, 5-10 years, according to you?
So I think this question is honestly beyond the scope of my comprehension of NAPCCs, but um, deferring to the wisdom of people much smarter than I would say that one major gap is that they did not really make use of the potential for um, integrating some of these actions. So rather than putting water and energy separately, there was a scope for integrating these two together. Like, because these systems are not separate from each other, they interact with each other. So if you're going to take action in one sector, it is going to reflect in some or the other way in another sector. But that so far is not really being reflected in climate policy in general, and that's a major gap. As to whether it's going to be
Got it.
addressed or not, I cannot say to that at all.
Okay. That's quite useful. Something else that I also thought about was the integration at a scale level as well. So LAPCCs, are coming from the SAPCCs, and SAPCCs are coming from the NAPCCs. Um, and that kind of like overall integration is something which I haven't seen personally. I have very limited knowledge, so I might be wrong as well. But that's also another observation that I had in terms of that scale level integration as well. And that's something which I thought I would share.
Yeah. I mean, regionally, it depends on how efficient your governance structure is. So it varies from place to place, but yeah, in most of the cases, people are not really talking to each other across scales. Everybody is sort of doing what they're told.
Yeah,
No
yeah,
iterative process.
yeah. One place where I saw that as an exception is just COVID, where for the first time I saw the state and national government like really working together, at least for the first 2-3 months, and that was just something which I thought was interesting. But yeah, thank you. I'm done.
Okay. Thank you, Aprajita, first of all, for the lovely presentation. I think that it raises lots of issues. So when I hear it, especially actually what you're, the little point that you made about Manmohan Singh saying that our emissions intensity will remain less, that sort of gives it away for me that this is perhaps not the document we want, or this is not the framework we want. And given how in India climate action has been top down, right, driven by technocrats and perhaps by international pressure and negotiations rather than a popular movement, all of this brings um, to me the various ways in which the way we are going about climate action is problematic and mistaken. Um, and and I'm wondering what, I mean, this is just an open conversation, it's not a question. Um, what might we be able to do to take this in a direction that is more closely aligned to the needs of Indian citizens, right? And not just this kind of, I mean, this strikes me largely as a fig leaf to say, okay, we need development, but we can see that this international pressure is going to grow, so let's set up a committee. I mean, that's how I read it.
Yeah,
So I'm wondering if there's a way to do this as not as a committee and more as a genuine response.
yeah, that's how it was. Although in defense of the SAPCCs, I think some places are doing good work. They have managed to do good work, although not at a level that is needed. Um, but also, I mean, at the national scale, too, we've sort of moved on from this attitude of uh, we need to uplift our poor from we need to uplift people out of poverty, except are you actually doing that? um, so we do have commitments that we've made internationally, but from what I can tell, there's very little integration between other policies, other climate-related policies, and this. So NAPCC started in the 2008. Now it's been kind of sidelined. Um, one thing that happened, one major thing happened, was that the Prime Minister's Council on Climate Change was reconstituted in 2014. No surprises there. And some very effective people were kicked out because they were making statements which were they were seen as hardliners. So basically, people who were pushing for actual action were kicked out and replaced with um, more favorable opinions. So, um, and that is the committee that oversees the NAPCC. So since then, NAPCC, I mean, they've stopped making too much noise about it. At the state level, action still continues, but NAPCC is now even more naam ke liye than it was ever before.
Yeah. I mean, what this shows me is that without political pressure, which is grassroots, it's hard to sustain, like, meaning then as bureaucratic or national priorities change, you will suddenly see like the kind of phenomena that you're mentioning, right? That the people who are calling for action are replaced by people who are more amenable to towing the line. And I think that the only way to change that is to put kinds of things that we want to do in response to climate change front and center into the public sphere. Thank you, Vedita and Nishit, for joining. We are actually 5 minutes past our time, so I want to thank Aprajita again for her lovely summary, and we look forward to those links.
Yes. How would you prefer that they be shared?
Just send it via email, that would be fine.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you for being patient with me.
No problem.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thanks.